Margaret.
On a visit to Salt Lake City, Gloria Steinem quipped that the LDS Church has probably created more feminists than she ever has. Certainly this was true in my case. My Mormon experience, particularly at the Church's conservative Brigham Young University, opened my eyes to the problem of being a woman. Personally, I had no objections to being one. Growing up, I liked dresses, pantyhose, makeup, high heels, and I was good at sewing and cooking and looked forward to marriage and a family. But I had two problems. I was smart in school, and I was not good at pretending to be something I wasn't. Qualities that became obstacles to finding a husband at BYU, touted as the most fertile matchmaking ground for LDS youth. Like most young Mormon women, I had been trained to put motherhood before career. In fact, I had no career plans at all when I entered BYU in 1967. But I was intellectually ambitious and very curious. I chose an undergraduate English major with a history minor. I also took the required religion courses, mostly glorified Sunday school classes, replete with whitewashed church history and dogmatic theology. But in these classes, I took very seriously the required reading of the scriptures and foundational Mormon documents. I quickly discovered that there was much more in these texts than I had ever heard from the pulpit. I found, in fact, outright contradictions between the two. These religious texts began to stir in me something I had never felt in church meetings. I caught a religious fervor that perhaps can only be experienced in one's teens or 20s. But I had a problem. I was female. All the best spiritual role models from the Bible and Mormon scriptures were male, and their service to God was linked with prophetic or priestly power. But my tradition affirmed that only men could be ordained. Priesthood was for men, and motherhood was for women. And yet I saw something besides these church teachings in the scriptural texts. Their priesthood was presented not primarily as church office, but as spirituality, love, and light and knowledge about bringing salvation and hope to others. What could be so wrong about a woman wanting this? But my culture seemed to say that God preferred men. My sex, which I had always seen as a blessing, was really a curse. All women were Eve, cursed of God. I had arrived at a crisis of faith. This happened as I was finishing my BA in English. I was still not married, so I decided to press on toward a master's degree in classical languages, with the eventual goal of pursuing through ancient languages my interest in biblical studies. I was preoccupied with finding out if women had always been second-class citizens in God's kingdom. They certainly were at BYU, where all university leadership positions in the 1970s were held by men, both as religious and academic authorities. As a graduate student, I saw all of my fellow male graduates mentored into prestigious PhD programs elsewhere, while no one seemed to see me as a serious candidate for an academic career. But I began to see myself differently. I was teaching Latin and Greek, and I was good at it. The academic life suited me. This success led to a full-time adjunct position at BYU. This, however, only intensified my crisis of faith. On the career totem pole, I was at the bottom, despite open acknowledgement of my dedication and talent. In the church as well, I was subordinate to and controlled by men, even when their achievements and devotion were notably less. Then two events occurred that moved me beyond crisis to a transformation. The first happened when I was allowed to participate in the LDS temple ritual. Mormons are not usually allowed to take part in this ceremony unless they are either about to leave on a mission or about to get married. I was not about to do either, but I talked my bishop into giving me the necessary recommend. The LDS Church emphasizes temple marriage that binds families together forever, but this is only one element of the temple ceremonies. The longest part of the ceremony is an initiation ritual drama in which Adam and Eve, representing each man and woman, take a cosmic journey through several stages of existence. As this drama unfolds, each initiate in the audience is invested with pieces of ceremonial garb that together constitute what are called the robes of the holy priesthood. Women are clothed in these robes exactly as are the men. As this occurs, women are told they're being prepared to become queens and priestesses, while the men are told they are being prepared to be kings and priests. In this ceremony, women officiate for women and men officiate for men. Of course, all this occurs under male leadership, but I had been trained to read a text, and I could clearly see that here was something I had never seen outside the temple. Here, women acted as priestesses to initiate other women. This knowledge changed me. I knew on a deep level that in the temple I was given a gift. I had been invested or endowed with priesthood. This came to me in a flood of spiritual insight where I felt God's love overflowing the rigid boundaries prescribed by corporate Mormonism. God loved and honored women even if church leaders didn't. The second transformation resulted more from a process than an event. At about this time, I began digging into Mormon history and theology. I discovered that Mormon women had more power, spiritual standing, and visibility in the 19th century than in the 20th. I learned that these women exercised spiritual gifts, participated in faith healings by the laying on of hands, a ritual only male priesthood holders are allowed to perform in the church today, and enjoyed more autonomy and respect than modern Mormon women. Eliza R. Snow, plural wife of both Joseph Smith and later Brigham Young, had been called a prophetess and high priestess, and her poems and sermons were influential in the church. Early Mormon women controlled their own organization and money, were among the first to receive the right to vote, were avid suffragettes, had ties to Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and published their own newspaper where they wrote ardently about women's rights. In the midst of these discoveries, I had a moment of awakening. It took place at a 1975 BYU assembly during a speech given by English professor Eloise Bell entitled The Implications of Feminism for Brigham Young University, a speech, by the way, that would never be allowed today. In it, Eloise argued that feminism was not inimical to the mission of the church, that our pioneer foremothers had pointed the way for us, and that BYU should strive for more equality in their treatment of women in scholarship giving, admissions, career planning, and in the presentation of knowledge itself. I was electrified. Here was another Mormon woman whose issues were my issues, and she had given them a name, feminism, a name that until this time had seemed foreign, something for non-Mormon women who didn't like men. But there on the spot, I knew that I, too, was a feminist. I felt linked to the cause. My dedication to feminism took the form of developing a broad feminist Mormon theology. I wished to show that at its roots, Mormonism was not only compatible with feminism, but that Mormon history, scriptural, and foundational texts contain some of the strongest arguments for women sharing equal power with men. From my own experience, I knew that LDS women and men could only see the sexist problem if they saw it in the context of their own faith. And I thank both Virginia and Rifat for emphasizing this today. Nevertheless, my interest in theology led me to borrow from feminist theologians of other traditions. Virginia Mollenkott, Judith Plaskow, Rosemary Radford Ruther, Elizabeth Schussler Fiorenza, Carol Christ, Blue Greenberg, Letty Russell. All of you women showed me how to reinterpret religious texts, how to question interpretive foundations, how to recontextualize evidence, and how to call power structures into question. My work resulted in my first paper, entitled The Missing Rib, The Forgotten Place of Queens and Priestesses in the Establishment of Zion. I presented it, a little ambitious. I presented it at a Sunstone Symposium in August of 1984 while I was pregnant with my youngest daughter. Yes, by that time I had married and had 4 daughters in 5 years, which slowed me down some. The Sunstone Foundation is one of a few Mormon venues not controlled by the LDS Church hierarchy. At Sunstone, it is possible to freely discuss and publish on Mormon theology, history, and social issues. In The Missing Rib, I examined the speeches of Joseph Smith given in 1842 in Nauvoo, Illinois at the founding of the Female Relief Society, the still extant women's organization of the LDS Church. Joseph Smith, in these speeches given on several occasions, made the stunning announcement to the women present that part of the priesthood belongs to them, that he wanted to show them how they will come into possession of the privileges and gifts of the priesthood, and that he was going to make them into a kingdom of priests. My paper showed how the first Mormon prophet included women in a priesthood council and was expanding their leadership role before his death. The women who received these blessings from him continued in this tradition in Utah. But after they died, the knowledge of these things faded. My paper caused quite a stir. Though others had been reclaiming Mormon women's history, no one had yet stated quite so boldly or full-heartedly that Mormon women had a legitimate right to priesthood. This was the first of a long series of papers I wrote examining aspects of Mormon theology from a feminist perspective. Many of these were published in Strangers in Paradox, a book I co-authored with my husband Paul. Other papers were published in the few independent Mormon journals. In these articles, I explored not only women in the priesthood, but the early and now virtually forbidden Mormon revelation of God the Mother. Joseph Smith, before his death, gave this revelation, and it was referenced later in a hymn written by Eliza R. Snow. One lyric reads, "In the heavens are parents single, no, the thought makes reason stare. Truth is reason, truth eternal tells me I've a mother there." Women's priesthood and a female deity were, in my mind, doctrines essential for women's equality, and foundational Mormon texts provided the framework and justification for both. For me personally, these publications were also important because they began connecting me with other Mormon feminists. To this point, most of my intellectual friendships were with men, and I had been isolated from other women. Writing caused me to network with like-minded women. As a result, I began developing personal friendships at women's retreats and discovering more of the feminist work done by other Mormon women, work such as the important 1976 book, Mormon Sisters, edited by Claudia Bushman, and containing articles by Laurel Thatcher Ulrich, Judy Dushku, Jill Mulvey-Durr, and Maureen Ursenbach Beecher. I discovered publications like the magazine Exponent 2, started in the late 1970s by a group of Boston women, and still publishing articles that provided an important support for Mormon women exploring gender issues through personal essay. After the defeat of the Equal Rights Amendment, which occurred in part due to the opposition mounted by the LDS Church, and after the much publicized excommunication of Sonia Johnson, Mormon feminism went underground for most of the 1980s. Private women's retreats during this period proliferated and served as an important source of support, empowerment, and consciousness raising. Then in 1988, some of us made another foray into the public arena. Two friends, Kelly Frame and Karen Erickson Christ, who were disturbed about the subordination of Mormon women in the church, felt that what we needed was a public forum for discussing women's issues. Karen and Kelly approached me, and the three of us decided to launch the group as the Mormon Women's Forum because we wanted to create a venue for discourse on women's issues that could include Mormon women with different perspectives. We held our first meeting. Some of Karen's conservative friends attended from her LDS ward, which is a local Mormon congregation. They later told her they were offended by my ferocious feminist approach. Very quickly, the group became a feminist one, attended only by those who felt in some way alienated from the mainstream. The first 2 or 3 years were very exciting. We discussed all sorts of issues: women in priesthood, God the Mother, abortion, Sonia Johnson, women's history, spiritual gifts, lesbian identity, sexual and domestic abuse, body image. Often 200 women attended these meetings. We started a newsletter that was more radical than any that had gone before. Hopes ran high that we could make a difference. This was not to be. 2 events deflated the power of the forum: internal conflict, which I understand is common in such groups, and increasing pressure from the church hierarchy that discouraged women from participating if they wished to maintain membership in the church. I was one of the first to feel consequences of the threat. In 1989, after participating in a debate about women in the priesthood that received local television news coverage, the classes I was scheduled to teach for the upcoming semester at BYU were suddenly and without explanation dropped. Over the next 4 years, the church increasingly pressured women to disassociate from feminism. To be labeled feminist was to be labeled anti-Mormon. Cecilia Concher-Farr and Gail Houston, 2 avowed feminist faculty members at BYU, were each denied tenure. Then beginning in 1993, a crush of church tribunals were convened to deprive many women of their church membership. Lynn Knavel Whitesides, Lavina Fielding Anderson, Maxine Hanks, and Janice Allred, all of whom had been involved in the forum and had written and published feminist works, were among the high-profile feminists excommunicated at this time. Since the LDS Church organization is centralized and universal, being excommunicated means there is nowhere else to go to remain part of the faith. It means being cut off from family rituals and community ties. It is to be labeled dangerous and outcast. In 1993, I was one of the first to be threatened with excommunication, but for reasons too complicated to explain here, I was not actually brought to trial and excommunicated until November 30th of the year 2000. Although I had been estranged from the church for years, I decided to attend my church court. When the men on the court asked me why I had come, I gave them two reasons. First, I didn't want them to cut me off without having to face me and see what kind of a person I was. And second, I wish the church could be a more open and loving community, and that I hoped that they would act in this way. I felt, however, they wouldn't, and they didn't. It was a kangaroo court from first to last. Church doctrine requires disciplinary councils to be fair, with witnesses and rules and people to support the accused. But none of this was applied in my case. As a lone woman, I faced 16 men, all part of the ecclesiastical structure of the local region. None of them knew me. All owed allegiance to the stake president, who is a leader over a large area of maybe 10 or 12 congregations. The charge against me was apostasy, now defined at the highest level of the church as public opposition to the church or its leaders, or teaching as church doctrine what is not church doctrine when corrected by a leader. I pleaded innocent to both, asserting that I had never opposed the church, nor claimed my personal beliefs to be official church doctrine. The stake president, who acted as prosecuting attorney, judge, and jury, produced as evidence against me a letter sent from my former stake president of 7 years earlier, in which he had forbidden me to write, publish, speak, or discuss anything to do with church history or doctrine in any setting. If I disobeyed, I was told that I would have church action taken against me. The head of the tribunal asked me whether I had disobeyed this order. I replied that I had said 7 years earlier that I wouldn't obey the order because it was neither just nor authoritative, and because to do so would promote unhealthy authoritarianism and corrode the spirituality of the church community. The court ignored my admission and proceeded to show by references to my many speeches and writings that I had not heeded the order. I was therefore an apostate simply for disobeying my leader's order not to speak. In the process, the court also tried to show the dangerous content of my speeches. When I attempted to defend myself by suggesting that my ideas were in line with many LDS scriptures and prophetic texts, the stake president harshly interrupted me mid-sentence, saying, "We will not allow you to lecture us, and you may not use that kind of argument again." I was never allowed to fully answer the many accusations. At the end of the trial, I was given a few moments to make a final statement. I knew they wouldn't let me defend myself, so I made a quick and impassioned plea for freedom of speech. Freedom or free agency, ironically, is a pillar of Mormon doctrine, and the U.S. Constitution is considered an inspired document. Freedom of belief, I told them, was the heart of spiritual growth. Can't we disagree about doctrine and yet still love each other? Can't we treat each other with respect even when we disagree? This got to them. Suddenly they were on the defensive. They all affirmed their belief in freedom. But, they said, I had gone too far. There had to be limits. They sent me out of the room for 30 minutes while they deliberated. Then I was brought back for sentencing. The stake president told me they had been impressed with me. I was both intelligent and respectful. So nice, really. But they had to excommunicate me, and I could not return to the church until I had publicly renounced all of my pernicious doctrine. How do I feel about my excommunication? I have to agree with my husband's description that it was a little like being gang raped by the Care Bears. It was violence done with politeness and a smile. I am no longer the naive and trusting BYU girl who believed that people and organizations would change if they could only see the clear evidence that the heart of Christ's gospel is equality, a familiar theme here. I am no longer in the LDS Church. However, I am still Mormon. This means I've had a major identity crisis. To be a Mormon feminist is to be marginalized in both the LDS community and the academic community. My 4 daughters, however, do not identify themselves with either the church or the culture. Like so many other young women of their age group, they have voted against the patriarchy with their feet. Although I am mostly cynical, the idealist in me still hopes that the LDS Church will eventually see what it has lost.